So whenever you feel you want to start, anyways.
We're going to wait one more minute. And there goes my minute. Well, welcome back, everyone, to Treaty 6 territory. The University of Alberta acknowledges we're located on Treaty 6 territory and respects the histories, languages, and cultures of First Nations, Métis, Inuit, and all First Peoples of Canada, whose presence continues to enrich our vibrant community. And it is John Burrows who is enriching our vibrant community this week. Welcome to his last event. I think it's been a great visit. I've learned a lot and I feel energized, which I didn't really think was possible in this particular time. But it has been a very energizing event. John is Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Law at the University of Victoria. Last time I mentioned that we had a problem with our YouTube links on the Department of English and Film Studies webpage. That problem has been solved as of this morning. So you are welcome and encouraged to look at the recordings of the previous events in John's visit, including his remarkable introduction of himself to us on Monday. When you see that video, you'll understand why I won't even attempt here to reproduce that introduction. The title of today's talk is kind of fascinating: writing as an Indigenous practice. This lecture will consider how Anishinaabe and other Indigenous norms can facilitate writing and reflection. One of the aims of the lecture is to build an interdisciplinary bridge between law and literature and between scholars and students. And I think there's probably a pun in there, since John has mentioned, for example, the famous or infamous Delgamuukw trial judgment from 1990, which hinged largely on the idea that Indigenous people are without writing and ironically and weirdly have too much speech so that their evidence could not be, could not get out of the stigma of hearsay. So I think John is going in a different direction today. So please welcome John Burrows, and I will now mercifully mute myself.
Bonjour, Ginawa, Miigwech Christopher. It's really been wonderful to be with you all this week. As I mentioned in an earlier lecture, I got to know Christopher when I was teaching at UBC many, many years ago, and it's nice to reconnect with him in this manner. And I've also enjoyed getting to know a few of you in this week that we've had together. And I hope that pattern of reconnection happens as you're in my neck of the woods, or I might be where you are somewhere in the future, and we can see each other in person. But it has been wonderful to be a part of this series. The beauty of this day, I can't just let go without commenting. Lovely to have the sun. It's an absolutely glorious day, and I feel grateful to be alive and to draw breath and to enjoy this moment in the time that we have. As was mentioned in previous lectures, I'm speaking to you from Wasanich territory and Lekwungen territory in what is now Victoria. I want to recognize the Songhees and Esquimalt nations as a part of the Lekwungen speaking peoples, and I'm grateful for being on this territory of which they have an historic and continuing relationship. Also mentioned today, I'm going to be talking about writing as an Indigenous practice in contemporary terms, but also connect that back some distance as well. And I'll begin by just sharing my screen to briefly go through some of these ideas or points. The idea that I'm trying to develop in this lecture is the notion of patterns, and that in the identification of patterns and the relationship that Indigenous peoples have to patterns, both in their presence and absence, is a practice that generates many forms of communication, including writing in the way we think about it today in books and articles and newspapers and blogs and tweets and whatever the case might be. But I'm thinking about this idea of patterns. And of course, any people participate in patterns, and there are opportunities for reflection, and then the processing of reflection and the communication of what flows from that reflection that is a part of those patterns. Anishinaabe people historically would record our understandings of what we were learning through scrolls. And I talked about that earlier when we talked about law, dream, and narrative in reference to drawing out law, and made mention in that book that I tried to put scrolls, or I did put scrolls, at least and facsimile of them at the beginning of each chapter to gesture towards this kind of literacy. It's also important to note that not only did we record on scrolls, but we did so on rocks and in the land itself. And so that we found ways to be able to communicate our relationship to place, our reflection about those places, our patterned relationships in relationship to those places in petroforms and petroglyphs and those other ways of thinking and expressing. Been telling stories as we've been together as well, stories about robins and bears and other plants and animals and natural forms. And in that way, there's a form of writing that happens right onto the bird, right onto the bear, so that when you see that creature, you have the possibility of reading or interpreting in relationship to that creature from the stories, the language, the songs, that you might have heard about them. It's also the case that the stars contain a vast scroll of knowledge that Anishinaabe people carry about their stories. And so if you look at the constellations, you see many of those constellations have a memory device attached to them because of the way that they are organized there, with the patterns that are present there, that people can look up and recite and relate to and read after that fashion. And then I've also made this point about a kinomagewin, which is looking to the earth and learning from the earth, taking direction from the earth. And in that way, there's the idea that the earth itself is an archive, that it has a way that we can relate to it that is storied, that is about this process of patterned reflections and expression. And in that way, there's a literacy that is not often practiced in Western institutions like universities or courts or parliaments or legislatures or other settings where people could walk with you in the outdoors and they could unfold the lessons of their people and interpret in relationship to the lessons of those people, challenge the lessons of those our people, be critical in relationship to that by looking to the bark or the soil or the serrated leaves or whatever the place where those stories, that writing is located. Of course, we've also done this with other peoples as we've entered into treaties with them. And here are wampum belts, the shells dyed and sewn into hide to create symbols and images that can be read, that communicate solemnity between Indigenous nations and then between Indigenous nations and the crown. And we've got this dish with one spoon wampum I talked about earlier, and then the covenant chain of the Turo wampum, which is two, so this river of life is the purple rose, and it's Indigenous peoples in their canoe, in their river of life, controlling their affairs, and the crown and its ship of state sailing down the river of life, controlling their affairs. It's this measured separation that people can read about. At the same time, there's this peace, friendship, and respect that joins folks together, peoples together. And you see that joining together expressed in another way as nations have their arms linked to one another. The British there at the end in the boat being pulled ashore, and then that mountain on the other side is the center place of Anishinaabe creation, is a good representation of how we meant to live together. There was 84 wampum belts that were circulated in this date, 1764, in my territory, that first created a significant relationship between the Crown and First Nations that's correlated with the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which of course is a document from King George III, also generated by the Lords of Trade, a Board of Trade, but not solely could it ever be read just in its documentary form. You have to understand the Royal Proclamation in relationship to the writing and ways that people would express their relationships through this wampum format. And then in my career, I've tried to talk about these things in different places, talking about case law and how the courts treat these issues, talking about the relationship between Anishinaabe law and case law as I'm contrasting and comparing Anishinaabe stories with Canadian case law. As we talked about earlier, drawing Anishinaabe life from community from community life as it relates to the environment and individuals, and that largely mediated through dreams. I've also published books about Canada being a multi-juridical country. It's not just bi-juridical, it's not just common law or civil law, it's also filled with Indigenous law. And in this book, I try to relate the nature and sources of law, the challenges of recognizing Indigenous law, and even the challenges of the common law and getting past its colonial constitution, and trying to point towards some trans-systemic practice and legal education. This is the book I talked about the other night, Freedom and Indigenous Constitutionalism, which is about questioning first principles in the many different chapters there, to understand the fluidity and the flexibility that Indigenous peoples' laws might contain, as it's verb-based and animacy-oriented and relationally correlated. As I mentioned, there's this idea of Canada's Colonial Constitution, where you have different narratives and two competing narratives, one that's framed by the doctrine of discovery and the land being empty, terra nullius, and adverse possession by the Crown, and notions of conquest, despite there really being no war. There's that kind of constitution that exists alongside the treaty narratives, the intersocietal, the putting together of nations in a multi-juridical context. This book was referred to also along the way, this idea of Earthbound Law, which takes its guidance, its correlation from the patterns that are found in the rivers and the sun and the grass, as we talk about Zigidwin, Zagate, Zagibaga, the idea of there's a treaty literacy that's found in the earth. And then this, of course, was the subject of my lecture yesterday, talking about Anishinaabe constitutionalism in relationship to our 7 grandmother and grandfather teachings. And so this is to say, I've tried in my life, in my career, to bring forward the writing of Indigenous peoples that's not always been in book form, but find ways to create an openness in the book form so that it doesn't get stuck in the book, and that it can jump out and live beyond the book, because it can be taken up in many, many different ways, has been my hope. And then my most recent books were about the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and ways that our laws are international and they are directed to wealth, but it might not be the kind of wealth that we think about in a strictly capitalist system, but it's a wealth of stewardship, it's a wealth of responsibility, it's a wealth of sustainability, it's a wealth that encourages reciprocal elucidation and the facilitation of gifts. Now, I've recently written a book, and it's not published yet, and you can see there's about 70 so chapters here that are reflections that I've had as I've just been in different places over the last probably 10 years, but by and large over the last 5 years, that try to reflect on my understandings of Anishinaabe life and law and art and poetry, and think about writing itself as a craft. And I'm very much influenced by this person who I keep mentioning from time to time, Basil Johnson. He is an elder from our community. He's subsequently passed, but he's the person I learned the majority of my language skills from, although I'm still not fluent and there's a lot for me to learn. He was a person that really encouraged me in that direction. He also is a family friend, and so encouraged us in that way. And he was a writer. He published a lot in his career and found many occasions to be able to share his work through over 25 books. And I thought I would give you my reflections about Basil in one of the chapters that I'm writing, to think through this idea of writing as an Indigenous practice. And so as a friend and a mentor, he would really help me think about Anishinaabemowin and its relationship to English and the ways that they were similar and different. And as an elder, he also helped me to understand my own reserve, Neashi Winigaming, as I mentioned earlier, the Cape Croker Indian Reserve. It's about 3 hours north of Toronto and 4 hours north of Detroit on Georgian Bay on the Saugeen or the Bruce Peninsula. And through Basil's eyes, I came to see my own family in another light because of the generational experience he had with my family. He carried many stories from his 86 years of life, including experiences with my grandpa Josh, who was someone I really looked up to. Basil taught me how to see the world through much broader eyes as a result. In fact, this understanding of the earth that I carry with me flowed from his way of talking, not only in English, but flowed from what he taught me in Anishinaabemowin. So his understanding of the earth flowed through and from his language, and I'm grateful for that, because through Anishinaabemowin, he helped me see the environment in a more detailed way. That is, I came to understand how we're related to the rocks and the ants and the seagulls, the maples, the rivers, the winds and the stars, and the rest of the natural world. He was really fantastic in taking me into that space. But his lessons did not stop there. As I've mentioned, for over 40 years, I've run most every morning, and I do that 6 days a week. And when I run by Basil's place, when he was alive, I would see him writing on his porch, right? These 25 books that he wrote, he'd be writing on his porch in the summertime. And in the winter, he would continue writing, but of course, he'd be on the other side of the porch window, inside his kitchen, cozy and warm. In all seasons, when he wasn't in Mexico, where he went for a few months in the winter, he would look out over the lake and he would create beautiful works of art. He had really immaculate longhand script, and he recounted the history of our people. Our trickster, Nana Bojo or Nanabush, came alive in his work. And he told us about Weendagok, the little people, bear walkers, others, along with our great, great, great grandmothers, all through his books. And in so doing, he explained the natural world and the human world and the more than human world through Anishinaabe eyes. And he left a great legacy as a result. But as I said, my learning did not just stop through what he said and wrote, because Basil followed patterns, as I've been trying to explain in the introduction here to this lecture, patterns. And in so doing, he disclosed another vital life lesson. You see, Basil would write when the sun rose. And after some coffee and a light breakfast, he would work for hours. In fact, he would work until he got hungry again, somewhere around noon. And at that point, he would get in his car and he'd go visit someone on the reserve, or he'd go to Wyerton, which is about 20 minutes away by car, and he'd have some lunch. And he'd visit with friends or just collect his thoughts in that space. And after lunch, he would return to his house for a nap. Always an important part of writing, particularly when you're an elder. And when Basil awoke, he would write for a few more hours before turning his attention to other things for the evening. And in the process, sentences turn into paragraphs. And then paragraphs would morph into chapters. And then chapters would transform into books. And these books accumulated to create a rich body of work that transcends his particular life. Now, as I was writing this letter, I mentioned Basil's customs to a new friend. And as we chatted over poached eggs and toast, she opened my eyes to another dimension of what Basil taught. She said something like this: humans embody patterns. We sleep, breathe, eat, and move in patterns. Our bodies crave patterns. Now, I'm sure her experience in the performing arts, sharpened this insight. She told me how her experience with martial arts also involved patterns, and she began to demonstrate this with a slight movement of her hands and arms as we spoke. And then I thought of yoga and how it helps people embody patterns in healthy and mindful ways. Soon dancers came to mind. We talked about powwows earlier. And then swimmers also came into mind. And then soon I began reflecting on my own habit of running. And my thoughts began to unfold further. Because I saw how Basil's writing, his work, embodied healthy patterns too. His discipline as a writer did not just flow from his mind, his heart, his eyes, or his experiences. His writing was embodied. And it was embodied in the patterns that he followed in his later years. His words were made of flesh. They flowed from a way of living which harnessed healthy patterns for the benefit of those who love beauty. Basil taught me that discipline allows our bodies and minds to flourish and create meaningful work and relationships with those around us. And what I see in his life, I also find some generality in the truth as well, which is patterns involve repetition. My heart beats in a time scale, and it circulates blood through my body with a rhythm. When I walk, my feet fall into a conspicuous gait and pace. When I talk, my words in English are usually organized around a subject, verb, and object. Linguistics involves patterns of sound and movement. Sound and silence are organized through words to enhance our ability to connect with one another. And through these patterns, our world expands as we gain access to other people's thoughts and experiences. Yet Basil's and my friends' insights runs deeper. Think of music, rhythm and beat are systemically arranged as sound along scales and intervals. Through duration and periodic rest, music is marked by sequences of sound and silence. And this creates patterns which move us. Genres of music are distinguished by recognizable patterns and cadence. And within a genre, there's significant room for invention. So what does this teach me about living? What does this teach me about writing? That is, if we live without patterns, if we try to anyways, we do ourselves a disservice. The failure to follow patterns denies a basic physiological fact. Therefore, we would do well to analyze and evaluate how our life is organized. We need routines. And I recognize that patterns are not only found within individuals. As I've suggested, they're also basic to human connectivity. We cannot live as couples or families or communities or societies without some patterns being replicated. My own professional discipline, law, is deeply concerned with customary and legislative patterns which organize us more generally. And what I do as I teach cases is look to analogies and distinctions to try to identify patterns in contract law or tort law or criminal law or property law, whatever the case might be. Now, I hope you're also listening between the lines here. As I've been hinting, patterns can be healthy, but they can also be destructive. We must choose carefully the cycles that we cultivate and follow. They must, at some level, harmonize with our bodily rhythms, and some patterns must be broken. Addictions can interfere with healthy ways of organizing sleeping, eating, breathing, and movement. Technology can also interfere with those patterns of sleeping, eating, breathing, and movement, as we know in this Zoom era. But also a voracious appetite for food or other things can also compromise our elemental functions. They're also cancerous, collective patterns, and they might be the most damaging of all. Racism, sexism, homophobia, colonialism are perhaps the most pervasive. They are often reproduced without much thought or effort because they are deeply embedded in our social, economic, political, cultural, legal, and educational institutions and systems. These patterns are pernicious, and they spread through families, churches, work sites, universities, recreational activities, and they often do so with ease. And these patterns can corrupt every group, gathering, and organization in one way or another. In fact, they do. They troublingly replicate themselves in our work, rest, and play. And we must recognize this and see that patterns are both the staff of life and the harbingers of death. Now, when I look at the patterns found in the natural world around me, I find reinforcement in this insight. Think about it. Atoms and molecules are arranged in patterns. Protein and bacteria are built in replicating ways. Fractal symmetries are seen in trees and mountains, lightning, clouds, leaves, and rivers. Days, seasons, and years pass in a systemically organized manner through the sun and the moon's influence. Snowflakes in our streets combine in complex ways. Each snowflake is recognizable as a snowflake, but each one is unique in its own form, which draws the conclusion that we should highlight the fact that a pattern can accommodate distinctiveness. It's true that our lives must follow basic forms. We must eat, sleep, and breathe in cycles to stay alive, as I've said. At the same time, there's a world of possibility in how we embody and express these basic forms, which leads me to just reemphasize a couple of observations. First, attentiveness to patterns suggests we must develop a discipline that matches our own body's function. One person will lift weights, another person will swim, another will go for a walk at lunch, and another will do so at the end of the day after an evening's meal. We don't have to all do the same thing to embody patterns in healthier ways. We really can be creative. And creativity is innovation in a pattern's repetition, right? Creativity is innovation in a pattern's repetition. We can find ways to make a pattern our very own. First point. Second point, just to highlight again, patterns involve both a presence and an absence. Music possesses strong and weak accents. Speaking includes vocalization and silence. Writing includes words and spaces. As I said, a heart beats and rests. The tide goes in and out. A painting combines positive and negative space. The space that surrounds an object is just as important as the object itself in creating visual representations. And that, of course, goes for writing too. Same goes for weaving. A weaver works with the gaps between the threads as much as the threads themselves. So my writing and most of my work tries to explore what lies between, behind, and beyond words, even as I'm trying to also express through words. And I hope that we find rest in the negative spaces of our writing, even as we journey through the text's obvious meanings. So I write in this way because Basil's teaching reminds me that life's patterns must include spaces for recurrent, organized rest. We cannot work all the time without eventually facing negative consequences. Same goes for play, right? Play cannot be relentless, nor fill all our empty spaces. In fact, we'd have no empty space if play was just a substitution for rest. Play can be kind of another form of work, though much more enjoyable in the moment than some of its other forms. But each activity needs to have this positive, negative space, a beat and a rest, a presence and an absence. And this goes for the minute details of the moment and the day, as well as a broader sweep. I'm grateful for times of rest where I neither work nor play, but just reflect. There's something about math in this. That is, there's a kind of geometry of my life, which includes a period for reflection and building other relations organized around other life's forces, rather than just the academic endeavors that we're engaged in. So I'm grateful for Basil's example in my life. Anishinaabe elder is someone who teaches us how to live well, who embodies what we call Mino B'Madzuin, a good life. This word personifies Basil's message to me. As I said, he not only taught in word, he taught in his life. And as I reflect on his life, I see wisdom in his deeds. Of course, he also lived in some unproductive and unhealthy ways, as we all do, myself included. That is, I don't want to exalt my friend. I merely want to respectfully honor him and acknowledge his good traits. I hope my own life's patterns can likewise be further organized and disciplined in creative, innovative, and healthy ways. As I mentioned earlier in the week, Basil used to teach me about freedom, Debain Nindizuin. He said, freedom follows organizational forms that are responsive to the earth's and our body's broader patterns. And I see this is true in our bodies. Freedom flourishes in relational synchronicity. We are connected to one another through ways we only faintly perceive. I want to find better ways of responsibly living in harmony with these deeper forces, so that I can be more effective in bringing forward those things that my ancestors wrote about when they put this in scrolls and on petroglyphs, when they would take us and show us the stars or gesture towards the robins and the plants and the animals. And I want to find ways to ensure that I always remember that we write with our bodies, not just our minds, our heads, or our brains. And when we think about that in that way, I went for a walk this afternoon to just enjoy the sun. And I was thinking about this talk today, and I thought, I'm actually writing at this moment as I'm walking, even though I might not be putting things down on a page, because I'm trying to understand patterns and live in relationship to patterns that I hope provide further insight when I might put something into a book-like form. I wanted to just conclude, there's my grandpa Josh, with some of the places that I would see when I walk around the reserve, places that I would see when I associate with Basil. And I just hope you see all the patterns that are present here in the way the sun reflects off the escarpment, the way the rocks have fossils embedded within them, the way the rocks relate to the plants, relate to the water in this really interesting liminal space, to think about what we see in the water. We have a creation story about a giant turtle. And sometimes when we look down, we see these remembrances of those patterns. We see reflections and mirrors of life as we look around us. Anishinaabe people organize the world into 4 layers. And that layering there, that reflectiveness there, is a part of understanding expressiveness and communication. I talked about animacy earlier and seeing in the rocks life, not just in the way that we think about life in this moment, but the ancient life of 450 million years ago, when Ontario was at the equator. And these escarpments here were coral reefs, and were swimming and teeming with little bodies. And now these bodies are stone, looks like they're dead, but these stones turn into soil, and then this soil again becomes the ground on which other things grow. And so there's a slow process of life that's present when you look at the patterns that are found there. This is a beautiful world of water and land and relationality that causes us to reflect, right? You see the 13 plates on the back of this turtle here, representing the 13 different moons of the Anishinaabe, and we teach in that pattern of moons as they come and go. I think I mentioned to you last month was Makakonsi Gizis, the bear cub moon. This month is Onabani Gizis, the hard crust on the snow moon. The next month is going to be Iske Gemizige Gizis, the maple sugar moon. And then after that is Zagibaga Gizis, the budding of the moon. You know, and so on the back of the turtle, on the back of Turtle Island, on the back of our relatives, we find ways to talk about organizing time and space and activity of humans in relationship to the natural world that surrounds us. Here's Nana Bojo or Wabos, Wabozo. And the trickster is there. There's treaty narratives embodied in the rabbit. He's got these long legs and long ears because he wasn't acting in accordance with the council's relationships at a certain point. So they pulled him, and he bears the marks of this sense of not following the patterns of sustainability. And you see the little flowers there, Wabiguan. Wab is the word for light, Igun is the instrument of. So these little flowers here are instruments of light, or they're also called Waskonie. Konie is to be dressed. Was is light again. Waskonie, these little flowers, they're dressed in light. There's a patterning there. Again, I've talked about all the stories that are found in the stars that surround us. This is Chibai Mikana. Chibai is the word for ghost. Mikana is the word for road. The ghost road, the path of souls that leads to the land of the dead. People have long used this as a text to be able to tell us about who we are and challenge that and interpret who we are and what we might be. Here's Misquaniquid, the red clouds that are coming in the morning. But people see in these clouds sometimes Anamikik, which is the thunderbirds, and how they produce a pattern of thinking about rain and storm and sky and then the clearing again, and many stories around them, what they give out to life with lightning, etc. They're just reflectivity, right? Here's the strawberries, Ode Imin. Ode is the word for heart. Min is the word for berry. They're the heart berries. They're not just the heart berries because they're red and they look like a heart, but if you eat the little roots that crawl along the ground and the way that strawberries reproduce in terms of if you boil them, that's really good heart medicine. Also, Odeamin was a person who mourned for a lost lover and couldn't get over that grief, and eventually looked everywhere to travel to that partner who had died. And so he ends up going along the path of souls leading to the land of the dead, learns about that life that's there, doesn't cross over at the end, comes back and teaches the Anishinaabe about life here, to be appreciative of it because of the knowledge of that life that he saw beyond. So this is not just a berry, it's not just a heart medicine, it's about how we understand our hearts as Anishinaabe people. And as I mentioned, the word Dodam, Odaman, is also, that is clan, totem, is associated with this word heart. They're just pieces of connectivity that start to come together as you stop, look at the fractals, look at the world that surrounds us and see through these patterns how we are a part of these patterns. Basil used to say to me, until you can look at that squirrel and see yourself in that squirrel, you will never understand what it means to be Anishinaabe. And I think that doesn't just go for squirrels. He's wanting to encourage, I'm wanting to encourage this idea of Nindinawe Maganidok. We are all related, including this relationship that we have to the natural world that surrounds us, the more than human world, the teachers, the professors, or again, the texts, the archive that gives us opportunity to understand our relationships. It's also there in our present history and in our past history. This is where my grandparents and great-grandparents are buried. This is the cabins that they lived in, the old Indian agent's house on the reserve, the church that my great-grandpa built, the Methodist church in that community. And there's a little memorial there where that is my great-grandpa and my great-great-grandpa are buried in that site. People who are currently passing, old schools, the activism around what's happening with housing on the reserve, and just these ideas. I think you get the point I'm trying to make. Look at all of this beautiful writing and the opportunities that we have to be able to find in our own expressions connectivity to those ways of being. And so I'll stop at that point and invite any questions or comments, reflections or tangents. Again, saying thank you for the opportunity that I have just to be able to share this work in progress and think about what writing from an Indigenous perspective looks like. Miigwech. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for your wonderful and compelling talk. It's uncanny, you're starting to remind me of the later Heidegger, perhaps without the politics, though. What are some of the consequences of this relationality that you mentioned at the end of this being interrelated, that you mentioned at the end of your talk just now?
Yeah, one of the consequences is that we have to find ways to understand that we should not be dispossessing the rocks and the plants and the animals and the waters and just putting them to our own use without thought of their own agency and ways that they proceed. So they're there for their own purposes and they have their own opportunities to keep interacting with one another. But then as we do that, there is an instrumental value, not that we would just use it for an instrumental purpose, but we then learn. We are, of course, sustained by that. And if it goes away, then our library goes, right? Or our internet is disconnected if we can't access the relationality, the love that we have, the teachings that are found with those things that are, only sometimes in particular areas, or only, they might be in other areas, but they only express themselves in a certain way within a particular area. Like there's birch trees all over the place, but birch trees might have their own personality in a particular place because of how they're configured with the other beings around them. And people can go into that and learn from that and read it as the case might be.
Thank you. Let's take questions from the virtual floor now. You can raise your e-hand, unmute your camera and wave your hand. Oh, so Sarah Krotz has sent you a question on chat.
Great. It says here, I was really struck by your description of writing as a practice rather than as a product. I wonder to what extent this practice is social, not just solitary, even collaborative. Love that question, because I think what I'm trying to suggest is it is a collective process. I write in relationship to the elders that taught me, in relationship to the natural world that surrounds me, in relationship to my own teachers, my own, and of course the people I read as well, right? When I'm reading, I'm just in a conversation of sorts. And yes, there's that moment where I sit by myself and there's a solitariness to it seemingly, but my body is connected, my mind is connected in such a way that your question just really encourages us to remember that writing is a social process, a collective process, a collaborative process, not just an individuated product. Yeah, creativity as relationality. I see that Mark here has a question.
I do, yeah. So John, first, thank you so much for such an incredibly rich series of talks. They've been, it's moving to me. My apologies.
Thank you.
So the question I sort of was thinking about a question in advance of today, actually, that was sort of, so I'm trying to think with all of the talks, and then what you've talked about today has sort of has thrown another wrinkle into it in a really generative way for me. And so the question that I was thinking that I wanted to ask was a question about sort of obliquely about setting, because I feel that running through your talks is a thread about setting as a kind of active practice and a relational practice against a sort of more, sort of commonplace understanding of setting as the background. And so I guess the question that I thought I wanted to ask was about setting and perhaps resetting. And now your talk about rhythm and practice has sort of added another dimension to this. The context that I'll give you is that the kind of work that I've been doing for the past decade or so has to do with petrocultures, so energy, and then energy transition, and the urgency of that transition. And I feel that the whole question about a petroculture, which imagines that energy isn't only about inputs, but is also about lots of things, the habits, the practices, the beliefs, the desires, that at first glance seem like they have nothing at all to do with energy, is a process of setting. It sets in place particular kinds of habits and practices and conditions that are then often very difficult to change. And it's urgent that they get changed because a petroculture is a really damaging culture for the climate and the planet and the people who live here, and all creatures who live here. So I guess it also feels to me that petroculture has a question about rhythm and practice. And so I would love to hear your thoughts about how the approaches that you take and the wisdom that you offer gives us a kind of a means by which to imagine resetting those practices such that we could change the practice and change the rhythm in some kind of a meaningful way when the time for doing so feels like it's urgent, it's pressing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for your heartfelt reaction. That's appreciated as a human being here. I really am grateful for that. And that's a very thoughtful question too. And so let me try to take that and say that I really like the inquiry about setting and that sort of framing that happens as we reset setting. And one thing that comes to mind is related to this idea of the urgency and the thought of time. Anishinaabe people regard time as being living. In our language, it's marked with animacy, which means it has its own kind of agency. And so time isn't just steady. Time, like with any being, can slow and fast, and you can have a different relationship as different people to time. And so that's just one point. And thinking about setting is the setting in time and the urgency that we might imagine or feel or be involved with time. So I mentioned there's one way of thinking about the climate crisis that we're in, and recognizing that the Earth itself is so dynamic that we've moved in Ontario from the equator to where we are now over 450 million years. And there was a time that humans weren't part of that movement, at least as we know it. And so there's a sort of sense of humility that life will go on without us. It has gone on without us. And it's not to say that I don't treasure and value and want to see life thrive and be sustained and be treasured for everything that it is. But I'm also not so proud, I guess you would say, to think that that's all there is. And there is something to see what's happening in that broader frame in terms of setting. And then, humans, at least Anishinaabe, have probably been around at least 12 to 14,000 years in their territories, if not longer. And we know that as Anishinaabe people, because it's not just the deep time that we have in relationship to the changing climate. We also have human time in relationship to the changing climate. We were there when the glaciers were receding. And when the glaciers were receding, there were all of these floods and all of these scooping out of new landforms. And our stories talk about these floods, and they talk about how these landforms came to be. And I have a cousin, Lenore Kijik, who talks about and who studied ethnogeology, both from a geological perspective, but also from an Anishinaabe story perspective. And we know a lot about the changing of our climate from that time. The Great Lakes used to flow out through what is now the Ottawa River. They didn't used to just go down through Lake Huron and Erie and Ontario. There was a huge change in that area. So thinking about the setting on human time, 12,000 years is not that long, and we've seen lots of different needs for adaptation. So we've got this deep time setting, we've got this human time setting, and then we also have this, what I call colonial time setting. 300, 400, 500 years ago, we lived very differently in our territories. We had buffalo in Ontario, caribou, passenger pigeons, butternut trees. There was ways that that place was teeming with life in a fashion that's no longer the case as cities have paved over broad swaths of territory and belched up smoke into the sky and caused acid rain, causing many of the lakes to die in a certain period, and preventing access and mobility of animals in the migrations, and of course extirpating animals there. In other words, just in the last 200, 300, 400 years, Indigenous peoples have lived through a climate collapse. Anishinaabe people have lived through a catastrophe. And if you want to learn about living through climate change, you can talk to Indigenous peoples and understand how that changing setting, if it's not properly related to, can be devastating, right? The trauma that Indigenous peoples carry is not just the trauma of residential schools and child welfare apprehensions and low rates of health and low rates of employment. It's also the trauma of seeing our beloved friends, our relations, our clans, our territories just decimated. And so there are things to learn about climate change in the recent colonial time. And then there's lifetime settings. I talked to my mother, she's 84 years old, and she can tell you about the collapse of the lake trout population and the collapse of some of the birds and the frogs and the salamanders. And she cries. The bats are really suffering in our territory, and that's just in her short lifetime. And so the setting there of like that deep time and human time and colonial time and lifetime really does influence us. And I talked about some of the sadness of those settings, but it also creates an appreciation because you recognize the fragileness, the tenderness, the care, the subtlety that you need to have a good relationship is such a thing of joy, and it's just rich, right? I mean, we know that in our human relationships. If you take the time to really get to know someone in their particularities and you have that sense of goodwill towards them, boy, that's just rich beyond me. Even if they struggle, right? Even if they eventually pass, the poignancy of the beauty of that setting hopefully is then expressed in our writings and in the other things that we do. So thank you, Mark, for that question and an opportunity to think about climate change and the urgency that we're under and why we need to cherish and then identify and then reset, as you've said, our setting to value those relationships and bring them back.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
There is a question from Brian McLean about canoes.
Brian, let's see here. So seeing the beautiful birch bark scroll, I wonder if there's any connection to canoes made from the same bark. Absolutely so. The canoe, as you might know, is one of the main forms that Anishinaabe people had for transportation. And I love the word in Anishinaabe for canoe. It's called Jimon. Jimon? And there's a ferry that travels between Tobermory, which is the top of our our traditional territory in Manitoulin Island, goes back and forth, and it's called Kichichimon, the great boat, or Chichimon is actually what my uncle named it. But the word Chimon also is the same word as kiss, like with your lips. And why is that the case? And Basil reflected on that, is because when you put your paddle in the water and you're properly going, it has that sound, like that kiss sound as you pull it in and out. What a beautiful love story. What a gentleness to have a relationship to the water that's like that kiss that you would apply in a human relationship as well. And so working with this bark and working with these scrolls is that exercise of bringing forward that kind of care and attention. We call the birch bark wigwas, and there's so many stories about humility, and people, of course, also drank the bark, the sap from the birch tree, just as you could tap maple sugar trees or maple trees, you can also tap birch trees, and they give quite a wonderful liquid, a little bit on the sour side, but nevertheless really energizing. And so, yeah, thank you for that. That's the same kind of technology that we would use for scrolls, that we would use for canoes. Thanks, Brian.
I think we have another question. I have to read it.
Sure, I'll read here one from Richard Costa. Dr. Burrows, let's see. Thank you, Riching. I look forward, as I do, to see you after the pandemic is over. I might have seen the news recently that Aruka, the last Juma male member and last Juma warrior, passed away recently from COVID-19. He was also the last speaker of the Kawahiva, or Tupi Guarani dialect cluster. In Law's Indigenous Ethics, you center on the 7 Anishinaabe grandmother and grandfather teachings of love, truth, bravery, humility, wisdom, honesty, and respect. And this led me to think of grieving and mourning one's elders and grandparents and loved ones in general. Could you talk more about mourning and grieving, whether mourning of a people such as the Juma, or the loved ones we may have lost in the past year, or even the loss of species and habitats you've just talked about? And as we mourn and grieve in our writing, what would you say is the role of silence, and can we best convey this grieving? Boy, that's a beautiful thought. You know, that my mother had a stroke in October. And I was here in Victoria, and she is at Cape Croker, and everything that I am wanted to be with her as she lost her speech. And as I didn't know how this would transpire. And fortunately, my sister is with her and was able to take her into the hospital and see to her as she was being cared for by the nurses and the doctors in that time of hospitalization. And I have to say, it was a time of trepidation, anxiety for me. It was also a time of mourning, just recognizing that I couldn't be there and that there was a loss that she was sustaining, that I also felt for myself and for her. And it caused me deep sadness, as you can imagine. She got this help from others and help from my sister, and fortunately she was able to return home from the hospital, and over the last few months she's been regaining fluency such that when I speak with her, there's very rarely a time that she drops a word or can't remember what it is. And so I feel joy again that's come from that mourning. But that sort of recent experience I had reminds me of experiences of losing my father about 2 years ago, and not being able to be with him, and sorely missing him, but carrying him with me in my body, as I tried to talk about earlier, through patterns. And maybe that's why I've written this forthcoming book. It's not before a publisher yet, although fortunately one publisher really likes it. It's called Along Life's Thin Edge, and it's about 209 pages, and the theme is death. And it's thinking about death and mourning and loss and passing and what we do in the face of that. And I suppose my conclusions are varied and many, but one of those conclusions is to just be eyes wide open in the face of loss and mourning and grief, and don't look away. Take it in, absorb it, feel it, experience it, embody it, share it, that feeling of sadness with others. And so part of the book talks in that kind of a language, but also eyes wide open, that as this sadness is happening around, the sun keeps shining, the rain falls, the raccoons outside my window crawl up the tree here, and they go to sleep on one another, and I watch the woodpeckers, and I see the life regenerating here, and so life goes on. And I'm not trying to deny the reality of death or my mourning. I just realize that it coexists and it interrelates and it intermixes with these other feelings that I have. And as much as possible, it's, as I said earlier, to beware the danger of a single story that goes for mourning and it goes for celebration. And nuance is sacred. And that nuance goes for thinking about death, and it also goes for thinking about celebration as well. And Anishinaabe people, when we mourn, we have many ceremonial practices that we engage in to help us and to help one another be reminded of all of this complexity that swirls around us. So thanks for that question. It's encouraging to me, given that this next book is about death and mourning and ceremony. Yes, mourning as worship.
Are there other questions? I'm going to go to Ruth for you. Survey the crowd. I think Brian has another question. Are you waving to the camera, Brian? No?
No, I wasn't, but if there's no one else, I will ask another question. I live in Toronto, where you studied and taught at Progressive Growers, and I know you wrote a piece about Tidal Creek, and also I have quoted to many people and recommended people to the passage about the Credit River in one of your books, and all the treaty language that you draw out so beautifully. I also volunteer with a group called Lost Rivers Toronto, and we lead walks along the waterways, sometimes the buried waterways like Tidal Creek, and try to bring people's attention to it, and also to Indigenous history. We are planning a group of events around Black Creek near York University and the Jane Finch community. One of the themed walks we're thinking about is a nature journaling walk that will encourage people to stop, look, and listen, and commit to paper drawings or their written thoughts. Just slow them down in order to make some of the observations that you do when you go home or where you live now. So I've stolen a few ideas of yours from today's talk that will serve as good prompters. Do you have any other advice about how to turn a walking tour into a creative exercise for everyone involved?
I really love what you're suggesting there, and by no means is it stolen. It's shared very openly and quickly. And in fact, I should say that in my view, that's living into treaty. Because I understand that when my great-great-grandfather signed a treaty, he invited people, when he put his otter totem on the document, to say, live in relationship to the laws that are here, what surround us, come and learn and be a part of this. And of course, bring all the good that you have as well, without disrupting what we have. And so to go and do that walking journey and observe and write in relationship to it would be probably about one of the closest things you could do to living that treaty promise, that treaty relationship that's there. And so I really, really encourage that. And of course, you've got the rivers on the documents of the belts themselves. You've got all sorts of reference to territory with bowls and spoons and not bringing anything sharp to that place. And just observe how the river forms bowls in certain places and in other areas. There's the outflow of the mouth where we're taught about love. And the river itself, as it winds its way through, has different lessons as a part of it. A couple of years ago, I was grateful to receive an invitation to go back to Toronto, where I did teach and love teaching as a law professor there. And I taught a course called Anishinaabe Law in Toronto. And I taught it in February. And we went out on Tattle Creek there, and I told the stories of that place, sang the songs that are related to water. Then we went out behind Wycliffe College there. There's a little medicine garden that Indigenous peoples have planted. And we looked at some of the, they were just the seeds and stems of last year's growth that had just died off there. But we could talk about what those plants meant. Mashkeke, the strength of the earth, we saw there. There was a cedar tree. Cedar is Gijik. Gijik also means sky. So we talked about the relationship of earth and sky that's found in the cedar tree. Then we went to Queen's Park Circle. We went around the front to see the legislature, and we looked at Queen Victoria. And I said, there's our relation. Because when we entered into a treaty with Queen Victoria, we made her our kin, right? She became Anishinaabe for the purposes of our treaty, because that's how we wanted to set up those relationships. And then we went to the anthropology museum, not museum, anthropology department, archaeology department, and we looked at the Wendat and Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe objects that are pipe stems and bowls and baskets, and we could tell some of the stories of that place through that. And then we went up to the Massey College, and in the Massey College, there's a Chapel Royale there that's downstairs, and the wampum belts are in that college. So we read the wampum belts, and then we had a beautiful feast after reading the wampum belts. And then we went into the Royal Ontario Museum and the Native Indigenous Gallery there. And there were more treaty and more opportunities to teach about the treaties and our relationships to one another. And the students also journaled and wrote in that setting as well. And just saying that, yes, you can do this at Black Creek, you can do this at Queen's Park, you can do this at Tattle Creek. And it's so fantastic to hear that you're living by the treaty and trying to think about how we can relate to this and see that that is the rivers, as our teachers and something that causes us to learn more about ourselves. Thanks, Brian.
That's awesome. Thank you very much.
Another question from Sarah on chat.
Okay. You spoke about the significance of what lies behind words. Can you elaborate on how Anishinaabe practices of listening and interpretation, whether literary or legal or both, work with those spaces or silences? That's a really good question, which I'll answer by sharing a story. I was invited some time back, maybe 15, maybe 20 years ago now, probably 20 years ago now, to Lubicon Cree territory in north there in Alberta. And we were invited for a sweat lodge. And Bernard Ominiak was the one that invited us in. And we were invited by Harold Cardinal, who I was actually his doctoral supervisor. So we got to know one another quite well. So Harold invited me, and he invited me along with Winona Wheeler, Maria Campbell, and myself. And we were told that this will start at 9 o'clock. And so we arrive ready for a sweat at 9 a.m. in the morning. And what happens is we sit there all day. And in sitting there all day, there's a lot of silence, and we watch the birds and we hear the winds. And of course we talk with one another, and then people from the Lubicon Cree would come and visit us from time to time and stay for 10 or 15 minutes or an hour, and they would visit. And then, of course, Bernard and others would come. And so there was these periods of silence, and then there was these periods of getting to know and talk with one another, and then silence again. And eventually, about maybe 6:30, 7 o'clock, they started preparing the fire to put the grandmother rocks in that would be heated up, that would eventually be put into the sweat lodge so that we could enjoy that experience. But, you know, it takes a couple of hours for this to occur. And so from 7 till 9, we sat some more and watched the flames of the fire, and of course participated and helped some of the activity in getting ready for that, but they were mostly doing it. And finally around 9 o'clock, we went into the sweat lodge. So 12 hours later. And I've often thought, was that just being poor hosts? Was that just being rude, not appreciative of the time that we were on as, you know, folks that were coming from universities and other places? And I don't think that is at all the case. I think they offered a great courtesy to us, a grace. They offered a real lesson that allowed us to sit in silence, to get into another flow, another rhythm, another pattern, so that by the time the sweat lodge came along, we knew a little bit about the people, we knew a little bit about one another, and of course we knew a little bit more about ourselves, having sat in that way. And so as a result, that sweat was quite meaningful to me, as it all of them are. And I can remember the feast afterwards, just thinking of how grateful I was for being in silence. And of course, even in the sweat lodge, right, there's singing that occurs, and there's some little bit of talking, but it's also a place of silence. And so yeah, the absence and rest, part of the patterns that I was talking about that Basil was trying to share with me, I really appreciate it. I like the life of an academic for that reason. I feel like I open my mouth in September and don't stop talking until April. But then come May, I'm fairly silent through until August. And you know, that is a nice cycle, a circle, a seasonal, a way of leaning into the work that I'm doing. And yeah, I just have to express appreciation for that as well. Rob has his hand raised.
I think another question popped up on chat.
Okay, maybe I'll read that first. As you said earlier this week that 80% of Anishinaabemowin words are verbs, the dynamism and relationality of that must really influence one's experience of the world. A thing is not just a thing. It is what it is doing, and always in relationship to other things and activities. Should we all be learning at least some of the Indigenous languages of where we live? I think so. The new course that we're teaching here in Indigenous law and the common law, the students come and get a JD and a JID. It's the first of its kind in the world. And there's a course in upper years that's Indigenous law and language. And these students this past semester learn with a Hulkaminam language speaker with the assistance of my colleague Sarah Morales, who is from that community, though not a speaker. And so she gets to learn her language as she's meeting with this elder, but all the other students get to learn the language with this elder as well. And it's not like we expect that they'll gain fluency, but they'll start to learn more about the land in this place by seeing how the language relates to this land. And when I ran a Wasanich field course a couple of years ago with my friend Robert Clifford, we did that over 4 months on the Gulf Islands and on the waters and up the mountains. Language figured very prominently. And the course was framed in the Wasanich language. Of course, the elders spoke in relationship to the Wasanich language. And then I had a different relationship with the territory after we were finished. I know where Claytos is now. It used to be called James Island in my mind. But now that I know it's Claytos, I know that it's water splashed upon his face. And I see that island as one of the ancestors of the Wasanich people, as opposed to just this James Island. And so, yeah, learning a language of the place that we're in can really open the possibilities for that relationality. Of course, not just with the land, but with the teacher who is Indigenous, and then with the other students that are in the class who might be both Indigenous and non-Indigenous. So yeah, lots of possibilities there for connectivity. Rob.
Hello again. I just the conversations, one of the threads or patterns I've recognized through your talk, and I asked it in the introductory, is the relationships between poetics and ethics and law and relationality. And as you're talking about patterns, I'm thinking about grammar as a way of patterning language so that certain unsaid principles can be understood, and others, I kind of think it as like cannot make sense in a particular grammar if the verb agreements are off or whatever, if the patterns are not followed. And similarly, genre, that genre coming from like genus and kind, and that sharing of patterns. And I'm wondering if you like,
yeah,
could reflect on that. Are those interesting concepts to you as you look at the different patterns, you know, different communities, human, non-human, otherwise, how those different patterns, story, language, and if genre is interesting there. Sorry, I lost it, but.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, which produces two observations. One, I think I've said this before, but I'll repeat. Algonquian languages, of which Anishinaabe is one and Cree is another, Blackfoot's another, they're polysynthetic, and they operate by morphemes, and each morpheme, each sound has a meaning. And so you can create quite a long string of morphemes to communicate a thought. And so one word might seem like a whole sentence in English or French. And because it's the verb that goes in the middle, that's given the preference, the idea is constantly inflecting that verb with different moods and tenses and relationality, as it were. And so, you know, thinking about that patterning probably says something about my approach that I'm trying to get across. But the other piece is that once you form a word like that, you can put these different words together and there's no word order, right? There's no like subject, verb, object, or object, verb, subject. There's no order. They can go together in a variety of fashions. And not the only, but one of the rules that helps us get sorted out where direction of attention is going is we have what's called obviation. And with obviation, you can have a third person reflecting about a fourth person, and even a fourth person reflecting about a fifth person. And so as long as you mark the word in its third, fourth, or fifth person, that can go anywhere in the sentence. And so again, there's a kind of a freedom there that maybe is not present in English because of the verb orientation, which then allows for the polysynthetic construction, which then allows for all of these words to go in different orders. And it's totally acceptable to put them in any order as long as you've got the proper obviation there. Now, reflecting on other lessons for that, for scholarship or law or poetics or literature, I think at least there's something to be thought about in the contrast. And then the question is, what do you do with English when it doesn't necessarily have, well, it doesn't have that way, of organizing itself? Are there things that you can point towards or gesture towards that nevertheless can try to communicate the animacy, the action, the dynamism? I suppose that's the body of my scholarship, and that's, as I've been speaking to you, what I've been trying to do, but I know it's going to be falling far short of what someone who was Anishinaabe speaking to another Anishinaabe speaker would be able to do with much more fluency and much greater fluidity, because some of the things that I'm striving to do would just be more par for the course, as it were, to draw a golf analogy out for some reason.
Thanks.
It opens up, you mentioned this word earlier in the day about composition. It just opens up other ways of thinking about composition.
Excellent. I think we have time for one more big question and corresponding big answer. So who wants to ask the big question? Don't make me do it. Joanna, please.
Hi. Thank you again, John, for another talk. And I was so one of the things that I'm trying to think about is and ask as a graduate student going through my degree is, what is an Indigenous writing practice? And I don't have tons of answers about that, but a number of things that you commented on tonight connect and resonate with some emerging reflections of my own. And so my question is, I guess, just asking you to perhaps elaborate. How do you, so I'm thinking particularly for students, graduate students and other students who are working in PhD programs that aren't always, that they're not, if we can say that they're not necessarily formed with, according to Anishinaabe principles or Indigenous, understandings of teaching and learning. And so you could either speak from your experience or just as you reflect, how do you counsel students who want to kind of dig into an Anishinaabe or other kind of sensibility or philosophy of writing, of storytelling, when they're working in forms and also in spaces and contexts that aren't necessarily Anishinaabe or Indigenous, if that makes sense?
Does make sense, thank you. Probably a few different layers to the answer. One is, as someone in the chat function observed, this is thinking about the practice of writing as opposed to the product of writing, like what we do. And so the idea of trying to find ways that you connect to your communities, you connect to your relatives, you connect to the land, you connect to those things that are important to you, and you develop a relationship with that in a patterned way with your body, not just spending time, although it's important to spend time with books and lectures and teachers, but that's not the only place to spend that time. And so for me, a part of that is drawing out, to use a word I used in a book, drawing out the non-conventional forms of reflection and relationship that might not be encouraged in a PhD program. And so, I mentioned about people could put someone out on the land, you could go through a fasting process, you could look at some of the stories, and like if I had time right now, I'd tell you a story. It's a story about Nanabush and the butterflies. I don't have time to tell it, but if you write me, I can share that story with you, because in the story, in my mind, is how to engage as an Anishinaabe person in the practice of writing. And it's a beautiful story about transformation in relationship to the butterflies, but it's also a story about starting on the outside and slowly finding a place where you might best stand to do your work of transformation. And it's not something that you know prior to coming into it, because it's contextual on what you learn and who you are related to. You can't predetermine, I guess the answer to your question is partly what I'm saying, but it is the practice of that puts you in a relationship to the land, your family, of course, the literature itself, the practices that are there. And I think, that can occur. I mean, I didn't have any guides in school when I was doing my LLM and my PhD, but I was fortunate, as I mentioned in my first lecture, to recognize that I was self-censoring. I was at first trying to think about writing a thesis that I expected was the standard for the field. And once I disabused myself of that expectation, then I became empowered and a little bit freer to be able to look at what I put in my introduction, which is the 7 generations of my family, and describe law through a genealogical story. And then as time's gone on, I've recognized that there's other things that I can be freer in. And so as I got tenure, it was the year that the Vanderpeet case came out of the Supreme Court of Canada, which I think is a very racist case. And so what I did is I wrote an article that turned the judges into the trickster, and I had those judges act in those ways like Nana Bojo does. And it really just created space for me to think newly about critique and engagement and respect. And so it's incremental. It dawned on me through time, and it's cumulative, and yet it's such a rewarding thing to do too. So a little bit of answer to the question, but I really would just sit with a story with you if we had that time, but I'll share it with you in writing. And then you can, whatever, we can connect about it again if you'd like.
Jimmy Gwetch.
Gwetch.
So that brings us to the end of our time and the end of our week together, astonishingly. So I want to thank John again for this wonderful series of talks and interactions. I think, John, you've allowed us to accomplish something positive and affirmative in these difficult times, and particularly difficult times here at the University of Alberta, which is undergoing a restructuring, which is really, in the language of your talk today, a depatterning. And your talk really made me understand the disadvantages of depatterning. We've been working on this since September, actually. That's how long it takes to plan a visit. So I'd like to extend some thanks here for the people who've made the visit possible, because when we started, I had absolutely no idea how to plan an online visit, or whether it was possible, or whether my application for funding would even be accepted. So I'd like to thank Claire Peters and Grant Wang, who have been in the background of all these meetings this week, making them work online. I'd like to thank Annette Gowdy-Roiger, who works in the Department of English and Film Studies, who has also been doing a lot of work to keep up the website and correct the links and make everything happen. Working from the virtual departmental office. And again, a shout out to the Distinguished Visitors Fund in the Office of the Vice President of Research and Innovation. And I would laud the Vice President's office for being very flexible, and being very flexible very quickly to make these events happen in circumstances for which nobody had a blueprint. I'll be in touch with you again, John, to tie up some paperwork, probably early next week. But I would invite everyone now to join me in thanking John in whatever virtual way is possible right now as we sign off. It's been great.
Thank you, everyone. So appreciative of being with you, and I do look forward to seeing you all one day. Bye-bye.
Bye.